A life left behind. Emily had never known what it meant to feel safe. For as long as she could remember, life had been an endless cycle of loneliness, hunger, and neglect. She had no bedtime stories, no warm embraces, no whispered words of love before falling asleep. At just 5 years old, she had already learned that the world was a place where children like her were forgotten. Her parents, Sarah and John, were nothing like the parents she sometimes saw in the illustrated books she would find discarded in the trash. They were ghosts who haunted their own home, appearing only to argue, to drink, or to disappear for days at a time. Their house was more of a shelter than a home, a crumbling space filled with the smell of alcohol, old cigarette smoke, and unwashed clothes. Emily learned quickly how to be invisible. She would curl up in the smallest corners, hide under tables, or sit quietly in a pile of blankets, hoping they wouldn't notice her. Because when they did, it often meant trouble. The hardest moments weren't just the hunger or the cold. It was the way her parents looked at her, like she was something burdensome, something that shouldn't have been there. She could see it in her mother's tired eyes, hear it in her father's sighs whenever she asked for something as simple as food. But nothing compared to that one night, the night that changed everything. It was a cold autumn evening, and the rain had started in a light drizzle before turning into a merciless storm. The wind howled through the broken window panes, rattling against the walls like an impatient visitor demanding to be let inside. Emily sat on the torn rug, her small hands wrapped around her knees as she watched her parents whispering to each other. Their voices were hushed, urgent. Something about their tone made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "Let's just go," her mother muttered, rubbing her arms. "I can't do this anymore, John." Her father exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping his forehead. "We have to. There's no other way." Emily didn't understand what they meant, but she knew it was about her. It was always about her. A few minutes later, they told her to get her coat. It was rare for them to take her anywhere, so she obeyed without question, feeling a strange sense of unease settle in her chest. The three of them stepped outside, the rain immediately drenching her small frame. Sarah and John walked ahead quickly, their shoulders hunched against the cold. Emily struggled to keep up, her tiny legs stumbling over the uneven pavement. They walked further than they ever had before, past the dimly lit stores, past the rows of old buildings, past anything that seemed familiar. The streetlights flickered weakly in the distance, casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. The only sounds were the rain, the occasional roll of thunder, and the squelching of their footsteps in the mud. Finally, they stopped. They were in an alleyway at the far end of town, a place Emily had never been before. A few dumpsters lined the walls, their lids barely holding back the piles of discarded waste spilling onto the pavement. Her mother knelt down in front of her, forcing a weak smile. "Stay here, okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than usual. "We'll be right back." Emily's small fingers clutched the sleeves of her mother's coat. Something didn't feel right. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. But Sarah pulled away, standing up and turning back toward John. Without another word, they started walking away. Emily blinked. The rain blurred her vision, but she could still see them, her parents, the only people she had ever known, walking away. She took a shaky step forward, her shoes sinking into the wet ground. Then the car engine roared to life. The red brake lights flared for just a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Gone. They were gone. For a few moments, Emily just stood there, frozen in place. Her tiny hands trembled as she stared at the empty road. She waited. Maybe they would come back. Maybe this was just a mistake. But the minutes stretched on. And on. And on. And still, she was alone. The wind howled through the alley, making the garbage bags rustle and shift. The cold was biting, slipping through the thin fabric of her coat and chilling her to the bone. Emily's breath hitched as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm. She didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually her legs gave out. She collapsed beside the dumpster, her small body shivering violently. Her stomach ached from hunger, and her heart pounded with the terrifying realization that she had nowhere to go. She was truly, completely alone. Hours passed. The rain didn't stop, and neither did the fear. Emily curled into herself, trying to make herself as small as possible. Every shadow, every sound sent her heart racing. What if no one found her? What if she had to stay here forever? Her eyelids grew heavy. She didn't want to sleep. She knew she had to stay awake. But exhaustion and cold were stronger than her will. Just as her eyes began to close, a distant noise made her stir. A car engine. Not the same as her parents'. This one was different. Softer. Slower. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating her small figure huddled against the dumpster. Emily barely had the strength to move. The car rolled to a stop. A door opened. Footsteps. A woman's voice, sharp with concern. "Oh my God." The figure approached, kneeling down beside her. Warm hands gently touched her freezing skin. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" the woman asked, her voice soft but urgent. Emily blinked slowly, her lips parted but too cold to form words. Another voice joined, a man this time. "Laura, is she okay?" Laura. That was the woman's name. "I don't know," the woman whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "She's freezing." Without hesitation, she lifted Emily into her arms, wrapping her in a thick, warm coat. "You're safe now," Laura murmured, cradling her close. "We've got you." For the first time that night, Emily let out a small, broken sob. She didn't know who these people were. She didn't know if she could trust them. But as Laura held her tightly, shielding her from the cold, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. A new beginning, or just another stop. Emily's small frame remained motionless in the back seat of the unfamiliar car. The warm embrace of Laura's coat wrapped around her, shielding her from the cold, but the ice that had settled deep in her bones refused to melt. Her fingers clutched the fabric of the coat, gripping onto it, as if it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The soft hum of the engine filled the space, punctuated only by Laura's gentle voice as she spoke to the man in the driver's seat. "She's so small, Mark. She must have been out there for hours." Mark's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. Who would leave a child out there? What kind of? He stopped himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "We need to get her checked out. Make sure she's not hurt." Laura nodded, her grip around Emily tightening slightly. Emily barely registered their words. Her mind was still trapped in the memory of that night, of the red tail lights fading into the darkness, of her parents' backs turning away without hesitation. They weren't coming back. The realization settled into her chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. She glanced up at Laura hesitantly. The woman's face was kind, her eyes filled with worry. But Emily had learned a long time ago that kind eyes could still belong to people who would leave you behind. They all did, eventually. The hospital visit. The car slowed to a stop in front of a building with glowing red letters, St. Mary's Hospital. Laura turned toward Emily, brushing a damp strand of hair away from her face. "Sweetheart, we're just going to have some doctors make sure you're okay, all right? You're safe." Emily didn't respond. She simply stared ahead, her hands gripping the coat tighter. Mark rushed around to open the car door, and Laura carefully lifted Emily into her arms. The hospital was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing night outside. The bright white walls and sterile smell were overwhelming. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the halls, their voices blending into an incomprehensible hum. A receptionist glanced up as they approached. "What's the emergency?" Laura adjusted Emily in her arms. "We found her alone in the rain. She's freezing. I don't know how long she was out there." The receptionist's eyes softened. "I'll call Dr. Patel. Have a seat." Laura carried Emily to a chair, holding her in her lap while Mark filled out paperwork. Emily's gaze wandered. The walls were decorated with faded posters about flu shots and hand washing. A mother sat across the room, rocking a baby in her arms. For a moment, Emily wondered what that would feel like, to be held like that, to be rocked to sleep by someone who truly loved her. But that was a dream, and dreams weren't real. The doctor's office. When the nurse called them in, Emily stiffened. The last time she had seen a doctor, she had been with her mother. Sarah had been in a foul mood that day, snapping at the nurse and rolling her eyes when the doctor asked Emily questions. "You're fine," Sarah had muttered on their way out. Waste of time. Emily didn't know what to expect now. Dr. Patel was a middle-aged woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail and a kind but serious expression. She kneeled to Emily's level, offering a small smile. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Dr. Patel. Can I check you over? It won't hurt, I promise." Emily hesitated but gave a small nod. Laura stayed close, holding Emily's hand while the doctor examined her. "She's underweight," Dr. Patel murmured to Mark and Laura. "And there are signs of long-term neglect. Bruises, malnutrition." She sighed, lowering her clipboard. "She's been through a lot." Emily looked down at her hands. She didn't like when people talked about her like she wasn't there. Dr. Patel turned back to Emily with a soft smile. "Sweetheart, do you know your last name?" Emily hesitated. She knew it. She knew her parents had called her Emily Carter. But something inside her twisted at the thought of saying it out loud. Carter was the name of the people who left her in the rain. She didn't want to be a Carter anymore. Instead of answering, she just shook her head. Laura exchanged a glance with Mark before gently squeezing Emily's shoulder. "It's okay. We'll figure it out together." For the first time, Emily felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was something close. The shelter. After the hospital visit, they drove to a small building with a warm yellow light glowing through the windows. The sign outside read Children's Safe Haven. A woman with silver hair and kind brown eyes greeted them at the door. "You must be Emily," she said gently. "I'm Mrs. Wilson. I help take care of the children here." Emily pressed herself closer to Laura instinctively. Laura sighed, stroking Emily's hair. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart. This place is safe." Mark knelt beside them. "We'll visit, okay? You're not alone." Emily looked between them, searching for any sign that they were lying. But all she saw was warmth. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. Mrs. Wilson held out her hand. "Would you like to see your room?" Emily's small fingers trembled, but after a moment, she reached out and took the woman's hand. As they walked inside, Laura and Mark watched from the doorway, their hearts heavy. Mark exhaled. "She's going to be okay, right?" Laura wiped at her eyes. "I hope so." But in her gut, she knew this was only the beginning. Inside the shelter, Emily stepped into a small, cozy room. The bed had clean, soft blankets, and a stuffed bear sat waiting for her on the pillow. Mrs. Wilson smiled. That bear belonged to another little girl who used to live here. She wanted it to go to someone special. "Would you like to take care of him?" Emily hesitated. Then, slowly, she picked up the bear and hugged it to her chest. For the first time since that terrible night, something inside her shifted. It wasn't trust. But maybe, just maybe, it was hope. A past that won't let go. The quiet hum of the shelter filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold and unforgiving streets Emily had known. Days had turned into weeks, and though she had grown accustomed to the predictable schedule at Children's Safe Haven, she still felt like an outsider in a world she wasn't sure she belonged to. She watched the other kids from a distance, the way they laughed in the playroom, how they ran to hug Mrs. Wilson after a long day at school, the easy way they accepted kindness. Emily didn't know how to do that. She wasn't sure if she ever would. A familiar fear. The morning started like any other. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the small bedroom Emily shared with another girl named Sophie. Sophie was different from Emily, bold, loud, and full of stories about places she had been before coming to the shelter. She talked about foster families, different schools, and even a puppy she once had. Emily never spoke much in return, but Sophie didn't seem to mind. That morning, as Emily pulled on her worn sneakers, Sophie nudged her with an elbow. "You never talk about where you came from," she said, watching Emily curiously. Emily stiffened, because there was nothing to say, because she didn't want to remember. Sophie shrugged when Emily didn't respond. "It's okay. I don't like thinking about my old life either." Emily swallowed hard. Maybe they weren't so different after all. As they headed to the breakfast hall, Mrs. Wilson stopped Emily near the door. "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you for a second." Emily's heart immediately started pounding. She gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. Had she done something wrong? Were they sending her away? She didn't realize she had stopped breathing until Mrs. Wilson gently squeezed her hand. "It's nothing bad," she reassured. "I just need to ask you something important." Emily nodded hesitantly and followed her into the small office at the end of the hall. Mrs. Wilson sat down across from her, her brown eyes filled with warmth. "Do you remember Laura and Mark?" Emily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her shirt. The couple who had found her. The ones who had taken her to the hospital, who had brought her here. The ones who had said they would visit. Emily had convinced herself that those words were just like all the others she had been told before, promises that meant nothing. But they had come back. "They want to see you," Mrs. Wilson said. "Only if you're comfortable, of course." Emily stared at the desk, her mind a tangled mess of emotions. Part of her wanted to say no, to run away from whatever feelings their presence might stir inside her. But a tiny, flickering part of her, the part that still clung to the memory of warmth, wanted to see them again. So she nodded. A visit that changed everything. Laura and Mark arrived that afternoon. Emily had spent hours convincing herself that she wouldn't care, that seeing them again wouldn't matter. But the second she saw Laura's kind smile and Mark's nervous excitement, something in her chest squeezed painfully. "Hey, sweetheart," Laura said, kneeling so she was eye level with Emily. "We've missed you." Emily didn't know how to respond to that. She just nodded, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "You look good, kid. How's the shelter treating you?" Emily hesitated before giving a small shrug. Mark glanced at Laura uncertainly. And for a moment, Emily wondered if they regretted coming. But then Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a small familiar object, a worn stuffed bear. Emily's breath caught. "We brought this back for you," Laura said softly. "We thought maybe you'd like to keep it." Emily stared at the bear for a long moment before slowly reaching out to take it. Her fingers brushed against the soft fur, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear, something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Laura and Mark didn't stay long. They talked about how much they had worried about her, how they had been hoping to see her again, and how proud they were that she was doing okay. And then, as they stood to leave, Laura hesitated. "Emily," she started, "we wanted to ask you something." Emily tensed. Mark cleared his throat. "We were wondering if you'd like to come stay with us for a little while." The room felt impossibly still. Emily's heartbeat roared in her ears. Stay with them. Live with them. She had spent her whole life believing that people only left, that no one ever stayed. Could she really let herself believe that this time would be different? The past always comes back. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat curled up on her bed, the stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to go with Laura and Mark. But something inside her kept whispering that it was only a matter of time before they left too. Just like everyone else. The nightmares came back that night. The same dream. The red tail lights disappearing. The rain soaking through her clothes. The sound of her own voice screaming for parents who never turned back. She woke up with a start, her heart hammering in her chest. But this time, when she opened her eyes, she wasn't alone. Mrs. Wilson was sitting beside her, her expression calm and steady. "I heard you crying," she said gently. Emily wiped at her face, embarrassed. Mrs. Wilson reached out, tucking the strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "I know it's scary," she said, "trusting people after everything you've been through. But not everyone leaves, Emily." Emily looked down at the bear in her hands. Not everyone leaves. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe in Laura and Mark. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe in something good. And so, when morning came, she made a decision. She was going to take a chance. Because maybe, just maybe, this time would be different.